Welcome to Patrick Henry's Red Hill. And this is one of the books of the week. It's Jean Fritz's book. It's kind of like a children's book, but it's actually a good primer for anybody who's interested in Patrick Henry. It's called Where Was Patrick Henry on the 29th of May? And there are times that I actually recommend this video to visitors when they're coming through Red Hill and I'm doing tours. Because again, it's a great primer. It's a great introduction to Patrick Henry. What Jean Fritz did when she wrote this book is she used the date of May 29th, which is Henry's birthday. And she kind of used events that happened in his life on or around his birthday, May 29th. So, Jean Fritz's book, Where Was Patrick Henry on the 29th of May? And I'm going to go ahead and read it to you right now, if you don't mind. May 29th, 1736, was a good day to be alive in Virginia. Spring was spilling over into birdsong, and the countryside was wild with flowers, daisies, bluebonnets, golden ragwort, purple vetch, all along the hillsides. Blue-eyed grass in the crannies, pink dragon heads in the lowlands. The rivers rushed, slanting across the face of the land, picking up tributaries along the way and darting off into so many crooked creeks that the old maps looked as if they had been drawn by men with unsteady hands carried away by love for Virginia. The names of the creeks are themselves a wonder. You have Hat Creek, Dog Creek, Sailor's Creek, Bear Garden Creek, Skin Creek. Now, in 1736, Hanover County had 322 square miles of land. They had three large rivers, each with its brood of creeks, and about 2,000 men over 16 years old. And it also had Patrick Henry. And where was Patrick Henry on the 29th of May? Well, he was in bed, crying most likely, drowning out the bird song. And why not? He had just been born and didn't know about the creeks and the woodlands. He was too small to know a fox from a flower and too young to be counted when they added up the men in Virginia. In a few years, of course, it would be different. Come a nice spring day with redbirds calling, and Patrick would be off to the nearest creek, a fishing pole over his shoulder. Now, the creeks quivered with life in those days. Bullheads, red eyes, flatbacks, rockfish, just to mention a few. Or he'd be off to the woods, a gun in his hand, and a dog or two at his heels. There were still wolves in Hanover County when Patrick was young, and of course fox, deer, possum, coon, and other game. Sometimes he would just go off. He'd mosey about barefoot through the woods or lie down by a creek and just listen, mostly to bird song. He had the idea that if he listened long enough and hard enough, he'd be able to figure out what the birds were saying. Meanwhile, he practiced imitating their songs so that he'd be ready to talk back. He became so expert that he could not only imitate a mockingbird, but he could imitate a mockingbird imitating a jay. Patrick had other listening pleasures. The sound of rain on the roof was one. The long, low, lonesome, faraway echo of his father's foxhorn. The bugling of the dogs on the trail. The sweet music of fiddles and flutes. Now, he did teach himself to play the flute when he had to stay indoors with a broken collarbone. The voice of his uncle, Lang Lou Winston, when he made a speech. On election day, it was said that Lang Lou Winston would roll his rich words into a crowd until he had the hair standing up on people's heads. His uncle was also a famous hunter and spent 6 months of the year hunting deer and camping out with the Indians. It was a small, cheerful world that Patrick lived in with many pleasures, but school was not one of them. Patrick had, of course, to fit school into growing up, but he gave it no more attention than was necessary. Come a nice spring day with redbirds calling, and he might not even make it to the schoolhouse door. But generally he was there, waiting for the day to end so he'd be free again, running barefoot and wild on the land. It was as if Patrick Henry had soaked up through the bottoms of his bare feet the two things that he prized most of all in life: freedom and the good Virginia land. Not that he thought much about them. He took his days for granted, and as for the future, he had no plans. His father, on the other hand, gave Patrick's future considerable thought. John Henry. John Henry was a planter, a surveyor, an officer in the Virginia militia, a justice in the county court, and one of the few men in Hanover County who had a university education. But he had a large family, and money was a problem. By the time Patrick was 15, he had, in addition to his older brother William, 7 younger sisters, all of whom would have to be supported until they were married. And then, according to custom, they would have to be provided with substantial gifts of land or money. So, of course, William and Patrick were expected to go out in the world and make their own living as soon as they could. William, however, was so irresponsible as a young man that John Henry centered his hopes on Patrick. But what was Patrick to do? Mr. Henry had taken him out of the local school when he was about 10, and he opened his own school for about a dozen boys in the neighborhood. The next 5 years, Patrick studied under his father. He studied Latin, history, mathematics, and a smattering of Greek. The trouble was not that learning came hard to Patrick. He just didn't like to tie himself down to it. In short, he was no scholar. Indeed, Patrick Henry didn't seem to have any particular useful talents. Looking back on their boyhood together, one friend remembered that Patrick had been a practical joker. Several times when a group of boys had been out in a canoe together, the canoe had tipped over. And after a while, the boys noticed that every time this happened, they would all be fully dressed. But Patrick would have his clothes off, ready for a swim. There's a picture of them. They're all in the water, and they're all fully dressed, and they're all wet. And there's old Patrick over there, no clothes on. He's dry, ready for a swim. Well, maybe not dry because he's in a river. Another friend recalled Patrick's underwear. No matter how sloppy Patrick's outer appearance, this friend said that his underwear was always clean. And when Patrick put on boots, he didn't do what his brother William did, just pull the boots over his dirty bare feet. Patrick put on stockings first. But none of these habits was likely to help him earn a living. In fact, his friends agreed there was nothing special about Patrick Henry as a boy. He had a happy disposition, he was fond of his gun, and he had a nice ear for music. And he had a way with observing people very closely. And like his sister Elizabeth, he had what was called a sending voice. That is, he could send his voice out so that it could be heard clearly at a distance. But still, he couldn't send his voice out and expect it to bring back a living. On May 29th, 1752, Patrick became 16. He was 6 feet tall, a lanky, sharp-boned young man with flashing blue eyes, generally dressed in checkered breeches and a jump shirt, generally in his bare feet. He was old enough now to be counted among the men of Virginia, and old enough to make his own living. And where was he? Well, he may have been stretched out on a sack of salt. People claimed this was Patrick's favorite resting place, and he did rest a good deal. His father had set up his 2 boys as storekeepers on the Pamunkey River, but William paid little attention to the store, and although people came in to pass the time of day, they seldom put down hard cash for the goods that they bought. Besides, the store wasn't always open. Come a nice spring day with redbirds calling, and Patrick might be at the store, and then again he might be down at the river or off in the woods. Or he might be across the county, courting. Patrick was sweet on young Sarah Shelton, whose father operated a tavern up at Hanover Courthouse. As it turned out, Patrick's storekeeping was a failure, but his courting was a success. When he was 18 years old, he got rid of the store and married 16-year-old Sarah. As a wedding present, Sarah's father gave them 6 slaves and 300 acres of land cut off from his own estate. So Patrick became a tobacco farmer. For 3 years, he went through the business of planting, cultivating, leafing, worming, and curing tobacco. And then his house burned down, and he had to give up the farm. There's a picture of Patrick. He's stretched out on the bag of salt. He and Sarah moved to Hanover Courthouse and decided to give storekeeping another try. But when they had only 26 customers in 6 months, they quit altogether. Patrick and Sarah had 2 children now, Martha and John, but they had little else. They lived with Sarah's father at the tavern, and Patrick helped take care of the guests. Many of them were lawyers, and their clients were doing business at the courthouse across the road. Patrick handed out refreshment, made friends, and sometimes entertained guests with his fiddle. At the quarter sessions of the court in March, June, September, and December, the most important cases were tried, and then every bed in the tavern would be taken. It did cost 75 cents a night for a bed with clean sheets. Traveling troops of acrobats and jugglers came to town at the time. Peddlers came to sell their wares, and there were horse races, cockfights, and wrestling matches. From all over the county, people came to see the shows, to do their trading, and to hear their cases argued. Patrick attended court as often as possible. He liked to watch a lawyer run his opposition up a tree. He liked to listen to him roll out the words, the way his Uncle Lang Lu did on election day. The more he listened, the more he thought he might like to have a try at it himself. After all, he was 24 years old now. He no longer had a farm or a store or even a house. He had to try something. So he got a few books and began studying on his own. I'm going to take a drink. It's a beautiful day up here in Ohio. I hope it's a beautiful day where you are as well. It was now the winter of 1760, about the same time as young 17-year-old Thomas Jefferson met him at a house party and was struck by Patrick's passion for fiddling, dancing, and pleasantry. But Patrick read at least 2 heavy law books that winter, and in the middle of April, he hung up a sign at John Shelton's tavern. Patrick Henry, the sign said, attorney at law. Patrick had been to Williamsburg, which was the capital of Virginia, and he'd been examined by 3 prominent lawyers, and he'd been issued a license to practice law. He'd also been told that he needed to study some more. In his first year, Patrick represented 60 clients. Many of them were his own relatives, in 176 cases, but the cases didn't amount to much, and he collected less than half of what was owed to him. Much of the time, he had so little to do, he'd ride into the piney woods for a week or more of hunting, sleeping under a tent, according to Thomas Jefferson, wearing that same shirt the whole time. Then, likely as not, he'd go directly to court in his greasy leather breeches and a pair of saddlebags on his arm. What Patrick Henry needed to prove himself as a lawyer was a big case at one of the quarter sessions of the court when the whole county would take interest. At the December session in 1763, Patrick had his chance. There was an argument between a group of preachers, or parsons as they were called, and the people. But in one sense, it was an argument between the people of Virginia and England. For a long time, England had been so busy fighting wars that she had left America relatively free to manage her own affairs. But now the French and Indian War was over, and a new king was on the throne, and there were rumors that England had a plan to rule the colonies more strictly. With the Parsons cause, it looked as if England had already started. The case went back to a year when the tobacco crop in Virginia had failed. And instead of selling for the normal rate of 2 cents per pound, tobacco was so scarce, it was now being sold for 6 cents a pound. This should have been good news for the Parsons because according to law, they were paid in tobacco. But this year, the people felt they couldn't afford it. So they passed a new law which allowed them to pay the Parsons in cash at the 2 cent rate. The Parsons took their case to the king, and the king vetoed the law, and now a group of Parsons were suing the people for damages and back pay. and Patrick Henry was representing the people. On the day of the trial, Patrick was uneasy. Not only were there more spectators than he'd ever seen at the courthouse, there were two men that he wished were not there. The first was his uncle, Patrick, who was one of the parsons. Patrick met his uncle at his carriage when he arrived at the courthouse and asked him if he wouldn't turn his carriage around. He had never spoken in public, Patrick explained, and his uncle's presence would overawe him. Besides, he might say something about the parsons that his uncle wouldn't like. So wouldn't he please just go home? His uncle complied. But Patrick couldn't ask the same of his father, Colonel John Henry. Colonel John Henry was the presiding justice of the day, and all through the trial he'd been sitting on the bench in front of the courtroom right before Patrick's eyes. Actually, Colonel Henry was just as uneasy as his son. He prayed that Patrick, who had failed in so many things, would not be an embarrassment today. But when Patrick stood up to argue the case, he was stooped. He was awkward. He was unable to look at the audience. When he spoke, he fumbled for words. He halted. He started sentences, stopping them as if he'd forgotten where he was going. Colonel Henry sank down in his chair and he studied his hands. He looked out the window. Patrick's friends in the courtroom stared at the floor. What on earth had Patrick done with his voice, they asked themselves. Why didn't he send it? And look at this picture. There's Colonel Henry. He's the judge. And look at everybody in the audience. They're just laughing at poor Patrick. Why didn't he send his voice? Then all at once, something seemed to come over Patrick. He stopped thinking about the people in the courtroom and about his father looking out the window, and he began thinking about the king of England, and how he could, if he wanted, he could change the character of the cheerful, independent world that Patrick lived in. Patrick Henry straightened up. He threw back his head and he sent his voice out in anger. How did the king know how much Virginians could pay their parsons? He asked. What right did he have to interfere? Patrick was rolling his words now, just like his uncle Lang Lu. He was doing things with his voice that he had never known that he could do, lowering it, raising it, not only to fit his emotions, but in such a way to stir the emotions of everyone in the courtroom. The crowd sat transfixed. So did Colonel Henry. And why not? Here was Patrick Henry, a poor country lawyer, turning himself into an orator right before their eyes. He talked for an hour. What about the parsons? He asked. Were they feeding the hungry? Clothing the naked, just as the scriptures had told them to do? No, he said. They were getting the king's permission to grab the last hoe cake from an honest farmer, or to take the milk cow from a poor widow. When Patrick had finished, the jury took just 5 minutes to reach their decision. They could not deny the parsons all the damages, since a previous court had ruled they had to be paid something. But after hearing Patrick, they allowed the parsons so much less than they had asked for that the parsons demanded a retrial, and they were refused. The people in the courthouse were beside themselves with excitement at Patrick's success. As soon as court was adjourned, they raised him onto their shoulders and carried him around the courtyard, hip, hip, hurrahing all the way. As for Colonel Henry, when asked about his son's performance, he smiled. He'd been pleasantly surprised, he said. It was a good thing for America, as it turned out, that Patrick Henry became an orator at the same time that England was unfolding their new plan. Taxation was England's next step. Although Americans had always managed their own money, suddenly in 1765, the English government, without any kind of by your leave from America, slapped down a stamp tax on the colonies. It had provisions for taxing 55 separate items, and Patrick Henry was ready to fight every one of them. On May 29th, 1765, Patrick became 29 years old. He and Sarah had 4 children now, and they were living in a 4-room house on top of a hill over in Louisa County. And on the 29th of May, what was he doing? Well, he was bawling out the king again. He had become a member of the prestigious House of Burgesses, Virginia's governing body, only 9 days before. And now he was standing up in his buckskin breeches before the finest men of Virginia. He was using such bold language that at one point there was a cry of treason. But Patrick went right on reeling off resolutions. Later, these resolutions were printed and they were sent throughout the colonies, giving other Americans courage to oppose this taxation. Indeed, there was so much opposition to the stamp tax that after a year, the king repealed it. But England did not give up the idea of taxation, nor did Patrick give up talking. In 1773, when England decided to enforce a tax on tea, Patrick went right to the floor of the House. He was so spellbinding that in the middle of one speech, the spectators rushed from the gallery to the cupola of the Capitol and pulled down the English flag. Here's a picture of them pulling down the English flag on top of the Capitol. And Patrick Henry with the big word treason. The members of the House, noticing all this commotion, thought that there was a fire and they ran for safety. Patrick and Sarah had 6 children now, and they were back in Hanover County in an 18-room house set on 1,000 acres. Patrick was a public figure. When he went out, he wore a black suit, or perhaps his peach blossom colored one, silver buckled shoes, and a tie wig, which he was said to twirl around his head when he was excited. Yeah, apparently Patrick Henry didn't care a whole lot about how his wig looked. Yet his private life contained much sadness. After the birth of their 6th child, Sarah lost her mind, turning on her husband and her own children in such a way that until she died in 1775, she had to be confined to her own room. Unfortunately, the years of Sarah's illness were also a critical year in the country. And again, Patrick Henry was obliged to leave home. During one of her most severe spells, he was with George Washington in Philadelphia, attending the Continental Congress. On March 23rd, 1775, just a few weeks after Sarah's death, Patrick delivered his most famous speech at St. John's Church in Richmond. By this time, everyone knew who Mr. Henry was. They had all heard of his passion for liberty and of the extraordinary quality of his voice. There were those who swore that Patrick Henry could not even announce that it was a cold evening without inspiring awe. So, of course, on March 23rd, St. John's Church was filled to overflowing. People standing in the aisles, in the doorways, sitting on the window ledges. Patrick Henry was angry, not only at the king who was disregarding America's petitions and insisting on taxation and preparing for war, but he was also angry at those people in America who still wanted to be friendly with the king and to keep peace. Patrick stood up, pushed his glasses back on his head, which was what he did when he was ready to use his fighting words. "Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace," he thundered, "but there is no peace. Is life so dear? Is peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery?" Patrick bowed his body and he locked his hands together as if he himself were in chains. Then suddenly he raised his chained hands over his head. "Forbid it, Almighty God," he cried. "I know not what course others may take, but as for me, Then Patrick dropped his arms. He threw back his body and he strained against his imaginary chains until the tendons in his neck stood out like the whip cords and the chains seemed to break. Then he raised his right hand in which he held an ivory letter opener. "As for me," he cried, "give me liberty or give me death." And then he plunged the letter opener in such a way that it looked as if it were plunged into his heart. The crowd went wild with excitement. One man leaning over the balcony was so aroused that he forgot where he was and he spit tobacco juice into the audience below. Another man jumped down from the window ledge and declared that when he died, he wanted to be buried on this very spot that Patrick Henry had delivered these words. And do you know what? 25 years later, that man actually was buried on that spot. The next year, war came to Virginia, and the volunteers marched off to battle with liberty or death embroidered on their shirt fronts. As for Patrick Henry, the people, they elected him their governor. On May 29th, 1777, he was elected for the second time. He was now 41 years old, living in the luxurious palace where the royal governors had lived for 55 years. And he was busy, so busy that if a nice spring day came along, he wouldn't have even heard a redbird call. Indeed, he scarcely had time for his private life. Yet he did have one rather important matter to attend to. Patrick wanted to marry 21-year-old Dorothea Dandridge of Hanover County. That is, if he could find the time. Between his election as governor and his inauguration, he managed to take a week off and squeeze in some courting. On October 7th, he traveled again to Hanover County, and he married Dorothea on the 9th and was back in Williamsburg on the 15th. Fortunately, he was back in time to hear the good news that the American army had defeated the English at Saratoga, New York. This was the first major victory for the Americans, the turning point in the war. And so, of course, throughout the land, people celebrated. In Williamsburg, there was a grand illumination. Every window in every house, including the many windows of the governor's palace, held a lighted candle. And in the cupola of the palace, a lantern blazed. Bells rang, soldiers paraded, drums beat, people partied, they danced, they shouted and sang. Walter Lennox, a wig maker, celebrated so hard that he imagined he was a cannon. Boom, booming and bang, banging all night. He insisted that cannons did not go to bed. Altogether, Patrick served as Virginia's governor 5 times. He was a good governor, but he had been remembered best as an orator. He spoke less often now, but once after the war stopped, he stepped into the speaker's platform, and on and off for 2 weeks he stayed there. The issue was the Constitution of the United States. Patrick was against it. He had always imagined that after Americans had disposed of England, they would settle down state by state to the cheerful, independent world he had known as a boy. There would, of course, be a federal government, but not one with the powers that this Constitution proposed. The individual and his rights would be of first importance. But in this Constitution, freedom of speech was not even mentioned, or freedom of religion, or other freedoms that Patrick regarded so highly. So in 1788, when Virginia held a convention to decide whether to approve the Constitution, Patrick traveled to Richmond to speak his piece. Several times, he made 3 speeches in one day. Once he made 5. Once he made 8. On one day, he spoke all day long, and the people listened to him with the same excitement as they always had. His eyes still held that famous Patrick flash, they said. And when he held up his arms, he seemed to be covering the whole room. A diamond ring blazed from one of his fingers. But impressed as the people were, more voted for the Constitution than against it, and it was eventually approved by all the states. Still, Patrick's marathon speaking had an effect. After the new government was formed, a Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution with all those freedoms that Patrick had fought for. On May 29th, 1796, Patrick Henry was 60 years old. He had retired from public life, and though he often grumbled about the government, his private world was as cheerful as any and more comfortable than most. He had lived many places over the years and had accumulated thousands of acres scattered throughout the state, and he was proud of those acres. More proud, his friends claimed, than all of his public career. Perhaps even a bit vain. After all, people had once doubted if he'd ever make a living, and here he was, along with George Washington, one of the largest landowners in the state. And how had he done it? Well, Thomas Jefferson said that he had done it just by the use of his tongue. Not a good speaker himself and never impressed by Patrick's mental abilities, Mr. Jefferson added that Patrick Henry was all tongue. He was nothing but tongue. Patrick spent his last years at his favorite piece of property, Red Hill. Red Hill is in the western part of the state. He had about 29,000 acres, a river, woods, a story-and-a-half house to which he added a low-ceiling sleeping room so that he could lie in bed and listen to the rain on the roof. People bragged that Patrick could manage much of his estate without even moving. All he had to do was to stand under the locust tree in front of his house and send out that voice to direct field workers a half mile or more away. There's a picture of Red Hill. I think some of you folks might recognize that, right? He lived just as he liked to live, knee-deep in dogs and children. Dorothea added 11 children to the family, and of course, by this time, there were grandchildren too. Patrick encouraged them all to go barefoot. He didn't like to see children in shoes until they were 6 or 7 years old, and he believed that if possible, they should avoid the inside of a schoolhouse until they were 12. Nature itself was the best teacher, he said, and in his old age, as in his younger years, he took every opportunity to enjoy it. Come a nice spring day, and Patrick Henry might be off to the woods, one child in the saddle before him and one behind him. Or he might be walking down to the river, trailed by a string of children and dogs. Or again, he might be simply sitting in the shade of the huge old Osage orange tree that spread its branches over most of the front lawn. He'd have some children with him, of course. His fiddle would be handy, and beside him would be a bucket of cool spring water with a gourd that he would use for drinking. And if a red bird called, well, Patrick Henry would be ready for it. He'd just lean back in his chair and he'd answer. That's the book. Where Was Patrick Henry on the 29th of May? I hope that you've enjoyed hearing this story read. If you'd like to buy this book or one of the other books that's available from the gift shop at Red Hill, you can certainly visit them online. If you go to redhill.org, you can check out their shopping page and you can see all the items that are available, including a mug like this one. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. You can email your orders to Red Hill if you email info@redhill.org. You can also give them a call at 1-800-514-7463. And They'll take your orders. Again, if you'd like to order this book or one of the many other fine books that they have available. I look forward to coming back to you by way of video and maybe talking about some of my other favorite books. But this is a great book for people that are interested in Patrick Henry. And if you've sat through me reading this, you know a lot about Patrick Henry that most Americans probably don't already know. So this is definitely one you want to pick up, by Jean Fritz, Where Was Patrick Henry, on the 29th of May. So I hope that you have enjoyed this time that we've had together, and I look forward to maybe doing this again. So thank you for being on Facebook with Patrick Henry's Red Hill, and give them a call or contact them at redhill.org. I'll see you again.